My Friend Flicka, Chapter 35. This is the last chapter of the book My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. When McLachlan said that if Ken thought Flicka was dead, he'd sleep for a month, he was not far wrong. When it was not sleep, it was delirium or stupor. The boy was most seriously ill, too ill to be taken into Cheyenne to the hospital there. Before long, pneumonia set in, and then the doctor spent many nights in succession at the ranch, driving into town early in the morning to attend to his practice. Flicka, on the other hand, gained strength steadily. Soon she could bear her weight on her feet, and Gus removed the sling. She could lie down and get up, take a few steps to the creek and drink when she wanted to, and she ate her oats with a good appetite. "Don't it beat all," said Tim to Gus, as they ate their supper in the bunkhouse. "Goes to show miracles still can happen." "Nah," said Gus, "it was de cold water washin' de fever out of her. And more dan dot, it was Ken. You tink it don't count? All night dot boy sit there and say, 'Hold on, Flicka, I am here with you. I am standing by, two of us together.'" Tim stared at Gus without answering while he thought it over. Gus filled his pipe. "Sure," said Tim finally. "Sure, that's it." "It's de boy now," said Gus slowly. "De little fella. He's turrible sick." Nell hardly left Ken's bedside. Rob or Gus attended to the cooking and brought trays to the door of the sick room. Once a day, Rob took his place beside Ken and insisted on Nell's going outdoors for 15 minutes or so. Nell would run through the pasture to see Flicka and would stand before her, trying to read the future. How was it going to be with Flicka? Would she pull through? The look in the filly's eyes was bright and observing. She turned her head quickly at Nell's approach. Her ears were pricked. Now and then she looked up the path in the direction of the house and whinnied for Ken. Nell would fly back up the path, running as fast as she could, and would reach Ken's room breathless, red-cheeked, and full of hope. But sometimes, kneeling beside the child's bed, the sight of him made hot tears sting her eyes. It was not only the sickness of his face, the fever, the difficult breathing, and dry, bluish lips. It was the utter weariness of him. It had been too much for him, this summer, this desperate striving to alter the pattern of thought upon which his life formed itself. Rob took Howard to school on the opening date, and talked to Mr. Gibson about Ken. He returned to Nell, astonished and moved at what the boy had done. "Did you read it?" he asked Nell in a low voice as they sat by the window in Ken's room. "The story of Gypsy?" "No, we decided that it must be all his own. If I'd read it, I'd have wanted to make suggestions, and as this was really an examination paper, it didn't seem right." Rob handed her the paper. When he had first read it himself, it had given him the strange emotion within his breast that his younger son sometimes caused. Nell read, "Flicka is the granddaughter of Gypsy, who was an English thoroughbred and a polo mare. My father bought her when he was a West Point cadet. Flicka does not look like Gypsy, who was pitch black, but she looks like her sire, who is a golden chestnut. His name is Banner. Flicka's mother was named Rocket. She was the fastest horse we ever had, fast enough to win races, but it was no use, because she was loco and she came to a bad end. Flicka is not loco. The way Rocket came to be loco was because she had a wild mustang for a father. His name was the Albino, because he was pure white, and he was a hellion, and stole mares from all the ranches. He stole Gypsy and kept her for 4 years, and when we got her back, she had 4 colts with her, and one of them was Rocket. They were so beautiful that my father kept them and tried to break them, but no luck. They wouldn't knuckle under, any of them, and he was sorry he had kept them, and let them mix their blood with our horses' blood, because Banner bred them, and they had colts too, and Flicka is one of those colts. Flicka's colour is just like Banner's, who is a registered thoroughbred, and her shape is a little bit like her mother's, and that makes her very fast, because the things that make a horse fast are long legs and a long body, and Flicka's are a little bit too long. But this is why she is so fast. She beat every other yearling. Flicka is my horse. I am taking care of her and training her, and when she is 3 years old I can ride her, and if she gets gentled she could be a racehorse, because she is fast and she is not loco. So that is the story of Gypsy. Nell finished reading and raised her eyebrows to Rob's. Flicka, 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 she said. He nodded. Yes, that's what Gibson said. As a story about Gypsy, it's a fine story about Flicka. Ken muttered incoherently, throwing one arm across the covers. Nell went to him to watch a moment, and to smooth the damp hair back from his forehead. He always seemed to recognize the touch of her hand, and to be eased and quieted by it. She returned to Rob. What did Gibson say about it? Said it was a good piece of writing. Says Ken's got a brilliant mind. Asked me if I knew it. What did you say? I said no. I thought he was dumb. And he said sometimes brilliant people were very dumb. In Nell's worn and tired face, the dimple of the right cheek suddenly showed. I didn't know Gibson was smart enough to say a thing like that, she whispered. Did you know it, Nell, that Ken is brilliant? I suspected it. What on earth made you think that? He's always failed at everything, till this summer. Well, Nell spoke slowly, thoughtfully. A dreamer, you know. It's a mind that looks over the edges of things. The way Ken can do what he calls getting into other worlds. Gets into a picture, gets into a drop of water, gets into a star. Anything. Rob sat looking out of the window. What did Mr. Gibson finally decide? Asked Nell. Said that as Ken had made a sincere effort, he would take him back into his own grade on probation. Rob left the room, and Nell sat looking out at the green. The leaves of the young cottonwoods had turned to gold, and at every puff of wind a shower of them floated down with a soft, rustling sound. Nell's eyes roved further, and she suddenly realized that all the colour had gone from the world. This always happened in the fall, quite unexpectedly, and there was no more richness of the summer blues and greens and reds. The landscape became drab and seemed to shrink in size, and so would remain until the snow came and transformed it again. In the 3rd week of Ken's illness, his condition improved. The fever went down, his brain cleared, and he recognized his father and mother. He was often restless at night. Nell, sleeping in the cot in his room, would be wakened by his voice calling, "Mother," and would get up and go to him, to sit on the edge of the bed, holding his hand, or smoothing his hair back from his forehead until he slept again. He never spoke of Flicka. With no duties, no demands of any sort made upon him, and his mother beside him day and night, he seemed very little and childish. He said one morning, "Don't you sleep at all, Mother?" "Why, of course I sleep, dear. What made you think I don't?" "Well, when I call you, you answer so quick, and in such a voice, it sounds as if you were always awake." "I sleep with one ear open," Nell's dimple showed. He looked up at her, tired but curious. "Which ear, Mother?" Often he was awake a long time in the night, and they had conversations. His mind roamed far afield and touched on events and themes Nell had completely forgotten. "Mother, you know old Mrs. Perkins?" "Yes, dear." "She's awful old, isn't she?" Yes, she's pretty old. Mother, do you have to grow old too? Of course. Like that? Nell laughed. I don't want you to change, Mother. I won't change, Kenny, not really. But your face will. That'll be just a false face, like you get at the 10-cent store in Laramie at Halloween. Really, Mother? Really, won't you change inside? You'll be the same you? Yes, darling. Then I don't mind the false face. Another time, he said. Remember when you said, Mother, there was something you'd been wanting awful bad ever since a few years after I was born? What was it? Nell did not answer right away. She wondered if she would answer at all. She lay on her side in the little cot, her face turned towards Ken. Over on the night table a lamp was burning, turned very low. Mother, it was a little girl I've always wanted, Ken. Ken did not answer for a long time. Then he said dreamily, We wanted the same thing, didn't we, Mother? How do you mean? Again he did not answer for so long that she thought he had fallen asleep, and her own eyes closed. Then she heard his weak voice. Do you know what little girl would be in Swedish, Mother? His eyes flew open. On the point of speaking, she held back the word. That was the nearest he had come to speaking of Flicka. He fell asleep, but his sleep was broken and troubled. He cried out several times, and at last she rose and slipped into her dressing gown and sat on his bedside, smoothing his hair. Outside a wakeful rooster was crowing. Though it was only 2 o'clock, Ken opened his eyes and began to talk about the rooster. He was fretful and complaining. They're supposed to crow when something good has happened, Mother. He's just a little young cockerel that hasn't learned manners yet. There's always roosters crowing, Mother. Don't they ever stop? Nell bent over him. They crow for the morning coming. But when awful things happen, still there's a morning. But if things have died... She didn't answer. Mother, he insisted, even then, there's a morning. The cockerel crowed again, his young, reedy voice like a boy's when it's changing. Nell tried to interest Ken in the little events of ranch activity, what the men were doing, what work his father was planning, but he turned away from all this. She sensed that it was too real and too close. He could not yet bear the impact of life. He talked about his room, his pictures, the familiar things about him, and asked her what had happened to them, why they had changed so. Changed, Kenny? Yes, nothing's like it used to be. It's you that have changed, dear. That makes everything look different. He twisted his head around to look, first of all at the pictures to the right of the bed, the tiny naked boy being held in the water among the ducklings, the man in embroidered suspenders playing a flute, the woman in gay pleasant dress, and then the one to the left, the mother holding a new baby in her arms to show it to the two children. But neither picture seemed of the slightest worth or interest. Something had gone out of them. His eyes dwelled longer on the picture at the end of the room, and the verse in the corner which said, Entreat me not to leave thee, nor to return from following after thee. This picture too had changed, but in a different way. Before he had felt something mysterious about it which he couldn't understand. Now he understood. He closed his eyes and didn't want to look at it. Nell was waiting for just the right moment to tell him that Mr. Gibson would take him back in his class, that the ponies had been sold for a good price, and, most of all, that Flicka was alive and getting stronger all the time. But Rodney Scott said, Let him wander a while yet. He's getting stronger. When he's a little farther along, he'll begin to show interest, and that will be the time enough. They were seated after dinner one evening before the fire in the living room. Ken was asleep. With the colder weather, Rob had filled the fireplace with logs, and the flames roared up the chimney. They discussed at length the change that Ken's possession of Flicka had effected in him, just why they had given him the colt, just what his failings had been. Between talk there were long silences, in which the fire held their gaze, and they could sit comfortably, thinking but not speaking. After one such silence, Nell said suddenly, "There's one thing that's been puzzling me. Why did Ken begin to dream at night, all at once, and terrible dreams? He used never to dream at all." The doctor's eyes turned to her quickly. "That's interesting. But when you come to think of it, not surprising. Why? All that stream of fantasy which used to pour out freely as daydreams, it had to go somewhere when it was shut off. So, forced to find new channels, it invaded his sleep." Nell's face was alight with interest. "So that's why he never dreamed at night." Dr. Scott nodded. "Yes, it's a pretty serious business, making a practical thinker and performer out of a daydreamer. It's something that psychiatrists often have to do, or try to do. Mostly they fail. Daydreaming is as potent and seductive as morphine. Once you've get the habit, it's got you. Lots of children do it. I think it's quite rare that it's understood or recognized in childhood when, perhaps, something could be done about it. Mostly it goes on into adult life, perhaps all life long. When doctors or psychiatrists get to deal with it, it's the results of it they see: inefficiency, failure, dishonesty, inability to cope with life, and then it's usually too late to correct the habit. Here's a case where someone recognized it and applied some of the methods of modern psychology. Applied just a little old-fashioned common sense, interrupted Nell. Rodney Scott smiled his boyish smile. "Between you and me, they're about the same thing, and I think old-fashioned common sense is still ahead. Anyway, that's what you did, and the result has taken this boy through most of the great experience of life. Falling in love, bliss, despair, sacrifice, death. If you could do that to every daydreamer, you could probably cure them all." Nell sighed. "We didn't plan to do all that. It just happened so." When the doctor rose to go, Nell and said, "You know, he still thinks Rob shot Flicka. Shouldn't I tell him the truth?" Rodney hesitated. Sometimes good news is as much of a shock as bad. He seems to have put everything out of his mind. But perhaps that's why he won't think of anything real, because he thinks she's dead. Rodney said, "I'll leave that to your intuition, Mother. When you feel the right moment has come, and you have the impulse to tell him, do it." Nell told him in his sleep, over and over again. Standing at his bedside, she leaned down and said very softly, "Did you know, darling, that Flicka is alive and getting better all the time?" Ken was so accustomed to her voice and to her moving about him that it never woke him. The first heavy snow of the winter came, and out on the saddleback the grass was covered, and the little colts, dressed in their shaggy coats of fur, whimpered because when they tried to graze, instead of the grass which now for the most part they lived on, their lips could find nothing but icy, tasteless, white stuff. Banner told them that their babyhood was over, that now they would have to fight for their living. He showed them how. Standing beside one forlorn little fellow, the big stallion pawed vigorously at the snow until a space was cleared and the grass could be seen beneath. The little colt reached under Banner's arching neck and nibbled at the grass. Banner cleared some more grass for him, urging him to use his own little hoofs. Then presently the lesson was learned, and all the small ones copied their sire and went about pawing at the snow. Fine weather came again, 3 long weeks of Indian summer, during which Ken gained strength rapidly. One day while Nell was cleaning his room, he asked her, "Whereabouts is Flicka?" "She's down in the pasture, dear. We didn't move her. She was doing so well down there. Would you like to see her?" After a long pause, he said wearily, "Oh, I don't know." Nell carefully dusted the objects on the chest of drawers. She turned to glance at Ken. "You never thought that she had been shot, dear, did you?" Ken hesitated, then said in a rather confused manner, "I don't know exactly. I had so many dreams. I didn't know what was true and what was a dream. I did think she had been shot. I heard a big shot. That was the wildcat your father shot down in the pasture that night." "Did he get him?" asked Ken with his first show of interest. "Not that shot you heard, but he got him at sunrise next morning. Your dad spent the whole night in the pasture there beside Flicka, so that the wildcat couldn't touch her." Ken, staring out the window, was visualizing this, and his face had a slight, smiling interest. "Wouldn't you like to see her?" ventured Nell again, but Ken turned his face away and repeated listlessly, "Oh, I don't know." With the doctor's consent, Ken was taken out for a short drive in the car, but it tired him greatly. There was too much for his eyes to see, too much for his lungs to breathe, and far too much to think about. He didn't want to go again for a long time. "It's as if he's lost heart," said Rob uneasily to Nell. Some days later, when there had been a light fall of snow and the whole world was an etching in brown and white, Rob wrapped the boy up, and telling Nell that there was something out on one of the hills he wanted to show him, drove down the road and stopped the car. Looking out of the window, they could see, a short distance away, where the range rolled up to the woods. "Look," said McLaughlin, pointing out of the window. On the edge of the woods stood a great stag with a full antlered head, blending perfectly with the brown and white etching. He was hard to see at first. His whole body was in profile to the car, but his head was turned around to face them, held very high, the eyes in an unswerving direct gaze bent upon the car there in the road. The up-curving lines of his neck and head flowed out into the trunks and then the branches of the many pointed antlers in indescribable beauty. Ken's mouth fell open as he looked. The stag was absolutely motionless. The word nobility might have been coined to embody all that magnificent creature expressed, or courage. McLaughlin glanced down at his son. The mouth was still open. "How did you know he'd be here, Dad?" "I just saw him driving in from the highway." "Why does he stay so long without moving?" "He's got a doe lying down there. He's protecting her. That's why he doesn't move." The boy looked a long time yet, then glanced up at his father. "Because she's his responsibility." "Yes." McLaughlin started the engine, turned the car and drove towards the ranch. Ken watched the motionless stag as long as he could see him. The boy's eyes burned. There was a choking in his throat, and all through his body a feeling as of rushing torrents. When he could no longer see the stag, his eyes roved over the hills and woods. He did not know what had ended the cold, weary detachment and united him to the world again. He only knew that it was his own once more, that it was beautiful and alive, that he wanted to see Flicka. And he pressed his face against his father's sleeve and wept. Late that afternoon, Ken, bundled up in a heavy sweater, slammed the house door, thudded across the green and opened the gate. He found a new pasture, snow on the ground, bare trees, the orange glow of a real winter sunset in the sky, and Flicka. Every day for weeks she had looked for him. She would stand at the corral gate with head up and ears pricked sharply, then, disappointed, whirl about with an impatient nicker and trot restlessly around the hill, then turn, point her ears and stand listening again. She had grown 2 inches in height and gave promise of being a big horse with speed and power and fire. She had a thick, warm winter coat of long fur. There was no swelling on any of her legs. Cold mornings she put her nose to the earth and kicked her heels in the air, or twisted her body and bucked, or galloped wildly from one end of the pasture to the other, her blonde mane and tail streaming. When snow fell, coming sometimes on a whining winter wind, she lifted her head high and sniffed at it with flaring nostrils. Now the slamming of the ranch door caught her attention, and she trotted questioningly towards the corral. Ken's quick feet thudded across the green. The gate rattled, and when the boy came running down the path crying, "Oh, Flicka, Flicka," the neigh that rang out on the cold air was a sound the filly had never made before. That's the end of the novel, My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I will be reading the second and third book of the Flicka trilogy, Thunderhead and Green Grass of Wyoming. So I hope you stick around and enjoy them as